Imagine a continent in ruins, cities reduced to ashes, families shattered, hope buried under the rubble of war. Europe, 1945, smoke still rising from bombed-out streets, children crying in hunger, nations broken not just in economy but in spirit. The world had witnessed devastation beyond comprehension, and then something extraordinary happened. From across the Atlantic, a hand reached out not to conquer, but to rebuild. That hand was America's. That miracle was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan wasn't just a policy, it was an act of faith. Faith that cooperation could triumph over chaos. Faith that compassion could heal what conflict had destroyed. Faith that the same power that once built bombs could now build bridges. Imagine a continent in ruins, where the skyline is nothing but broken walls and empty windows staring back at the ashes of war. Europe, 1945, smoke still curls from shattered cities, and the silence after the bombs feels heavier than the explosions themselves. Trains no longer run. Children wander streets searching for food. Entire nations lie crippled, their economies destroyed, their spirits hollowed. This was not just the end of a war. It was the collapse of a civilization's confidence. And then, from across the Atlantic, came something the world had not expected, a hand extended not for conquest, but for compassion. That hand was America's, and that moment was the birth of what the world would come to call the Marshall Plan. It wasn't just a political decision or an economic strategy. It was one of the boldest acts of moral courage in modern history. The world had seen empires rise through domination, but this was different. America chose to lead through generosity, at a time when it could have turned inward, when it could have said, "Europe's destruction is Europe's problem." The United States did the opposite. It looked upon a devastated continent and decided that rebuilding others was the key to rebuilding peace itself. The Marshall Plan became more than money. It became a message to the world that strength is not measured by how much power one holds, but by how much hope one can give. Picture the scene again: factories silent, railways torn apart, millions jobless, and hunger spreading faster than disease. In that chaos, the shadow of communism crept across Eastern Europe, feeding on despair and offering false promises of equality. Western Europe, weakened and desperate, was vulnerable to collapse. And then came George C. Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State, a man who had seen the cost of war firsthand. In June 1947, standing before the graduates of Harvard University, he delivered a speech that would change history. His words were simple yet revolutionary. The United States must do whatever it can to assist in the recovery of Europe, not for profit, not for politics, but for peace. He said that without stability, there could be no lasting freedom, and without economic recovery, there could be no stability. The plan that followed, officially the European Recovery Program, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. America pledged over $13 billion to help rebuild 16 European nations. To modern ears, that might sound like numbers on a page, but in the 1940s, it was a staggering act of faith. It was money that could have been used domestically, but was instead sent across oceans to rebuild homes, factories, and futures. It was as if one nation decided to give life back to a continent. Between 1948 and 1952, those funds transformed Europe's landscape. Roads were repaired, industries revived, and trade began to flow again. But even more important than the dollars was the spirit that came with them. America didn't just send aid, it sent belief. It told a war-torn people, "You can rise again." And they did. By 1952, Europe's industrial production had increased by 35%. Currencies stabilized, inflation dropped, and confidence surged. Nations that once stood as enemies began to cooperate through trade and reconstruction. The plan became the foundation for a united Western Europe, paving the way for what would later become the European Union. It strengthened democracies, weakened extremist ideologies, and proved that collaboration could accomplish what conquest never could. The Marshall Plan turned rubble into revival and despair into determination. It was proof that the human spirit, when supported with vision and generosity, could overcome even the darkest aftermath, but make no mistake, this was not just about economics. It was about humanity. The Marshall Plan represented a turning point in how nations understood power. Before it, power was about control. After it, power began to mean influence through inspiration. America showed that leadership is not about domination, but about direction, not about ruling others, but about guiding them towards self-reliance. It was an act of wisdom as much as it was of compassion. American leaders understood that a strong Europe meant a stable world, and a stable world meant lasting peace. In helping others rebuild, America was securing its own future. Think about what that says about vision. At a time when much of the world was still counting its dead, America was counting the possibilities. It believed that prosperity is contagious, that when one nation rises, others rise with it. The Marshall Plan was not a charity project. It was an investment in global stability. It recognized that peace has a cost, and that cost is generosity. It turned the lessons of war into a blueprint for cooperation. And perhaps the most remarkable thing was how willingly it was accepted. Nations that had once fought bitterly against one another now sat at the same table, sharing resources and rebuilding side by side. Out of the ruins of conflict emerged a new sense of unity, not forced, but chosen. This plan redefined America's role in the world. It wasn't about military occupation or political control. It was about building trust. It was about proving that freedom and prosperity could coexist. When the Marshall Plan succeeded, it sent a powerful message to the entire planet that democracy works, that capitalism can be compassionate, and that the way to prevent war is to invest in peace. It showed that the moral courage to rebuild can be stronger than the will to destroy. It reminded the world that nations, like people, are at their greatest when they lift others up instead of pushing them down. Every dollar spent in that program built more than bridges and factories. It built relationships. It rebuilt the idea that nations could cooperate for the greater good. It rebuilt the idea that generosity was not weakness, but wisdom. It rebuilt the idea that progress is only real when it is shared. The Marshall Plan became the seed of the modern transatlantic alliance, the bond between America and Europe that has maintained global stability for more than 70 years. It became the example every humanitarian mission since has tried to follow. It became a symbol that out of tragedy can come triumph if the will to rebuild is stronger than the urge to retreat. Even today, the world still feels its impact. Every international relief effort, every economic recovery mission, every global partnership that aims to restore stability after crisis carries the DNA of the Marshall Plan. It set the precedent that nations can come together not in fear, but in faith, not in rivalry, but in responsibility. It is a reminder that after every destruction, there lies an opportunity not just to restore what was lost, but to build something better. The Marshall Plan turned recovery into an art form and generosity into a strategy. It remains one of humanity's greatest examples of what can happen when vision meets action and when compassion meets courage. And as we look around our own world now, we see wars, crises, and economic struggles once again. We see nations divided, trust weakened, and fear spreading faster than unity. But perhaps, in this era of uncertainty, we can still learn from that extraordinary moment in history. The Marshall Plan teaches that the answer to chaos is not isolation but cooperation, not greed but giving, not despair but direction. It tells us that rebuilding is not a sign of weakness but of wisdom. It shows us that every act of generosity, no matter how small, contributes to a world where peace has a chance to grow again. It reminds us that the greatest empires are not built by walls or weapons, but by ideas strong enough to outlast destruction and hearts willing enough to rebuild what others have lost. Imagine the world standing still after the most destructive war in human history, a world covered in dust, debris, and despair. Europe was no longer a continent of thriving cities and bustling trade, it was a graveyard of broken nations. Smoke rose from the ruins of London, Berlin, Warsaw, and Paris. Streets were filled with people who had lost everything: homes, jobs, families, even hope. Hunger spread faster than disease, and fear ruled where freedom once lived. It was 1945, and Europe was on its knees. But while most saw devastation, one nation saw potential. America looked across the Atlantic and decided to do something the world had never seen before: rebuild its former allies and even its former enemies. That decision gave birth to one of the most transformative programs in history, the Marshall Plan. It began with vision. A vision that war could be followed not by vengeance but by restoration. The United States could have turned inward, protected its wealth, and watched the world unravel. Instead, it chose leadership through generosity. This wasn't a gift. It was an act of belief in humanity's ability to rise again. The Marshall Plan was not just a set of policies. It was an idea, a conviction that peace could only be achieved through prosperity, and that prosperity must be shared. In that moment, America proved that the greatest strength a nation can have is not its army or its weapons, but its willingness to build where others have destroyed. George C. Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State, understood this truth deeply. Having witnessed the human cost of war, he knew that true victory wasn't in defeating an enemy, but in rebuilding a world worth living in. In 1947, he stood before the graduating class at Harvard University and delivered a speech that would ignite hope across continents. He spoke not of revenge but of recovery, not of punishment but of partnership. He told the world that the United States would help Europe get back on its feet, not through charity but through cooperation. His words carried the power of moral clarity and practical genius. He said, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." That sentence alone captured the heart of the Marshall Plan. In the years that followed, the United States committed over $13 billion to rebuild Europe. To understand what that means, imagine sending an amount equal to more than $150 billion today. It wasn't about writing checks. It was about rebuilding the machinery of civilization. Roads were repaired, railways restored, factories reopened, and farmlands revived. The plan covered everything from fuel and food to industrial equipment and education. It gave nations the tools they needed to rebuild themselves. The genius of the plan was that it didn't simply hand out aid, it inspired action. European nations were required to work together to design their recovery, which for the first time encouraged unity instead of division. It forced collaboration, not competition, and through that cooperation, a new Europe began to rise from the rubble. The results were astonishing. Within just a few years, Europe's economies began to flourish again. Industrial production soared by over 30%, trade expanded, and currencies stabilized. Unemployment fell as people returned to work rebuilding their countries. The spirit of optimism began to replace despair. But the impact was not just material, it was psychological. The Marshall Plan restored faith in the future. It reminded people that hope was stronger than hatred, and that the human will to rebuild is greater than the power to destroy. Factories that once made weapons were now producing goods that improved lives. Ports that once unloaded soldiers now received supplies of food and machinery. The same ships that carried destruction during war were now carrying the tools of reconstruction. The Marshall Plan was more than an economic recovery program, it was a declaration of values. It told the world that leadership comes from compassion. America didn't rebuild Europe to gain control, it rebuilt Europe to prevent chaos. It understood that peace is not a natural state. It must be constructed, maintained, and invested in. By helping Europe rise, America also protected its own security and prosperity. A strong Europe meant a stable world, and a stable world meant a safer future for all. It was the ultimate expression of enlightened self-interest, doing good for others while doing what is wise for oneself. But not everyone believed it would work. Critics argued that America was wasting its resources, that the plan was too ambitious, too idealistic. They said the nations of Europe were too broken to recover, yet history proved them wrong. The Marshall Plan became one of the most successful initiatives ever undertaken in human history. It not only rebuilt economies, but reshaped global politics. It became the foundation of the modern Western alliance and paved the way for institutions like NATO and the European Union. It was the first great experiment in global cooperation, and it worked. The countries that participated in the Marshall Plan experienced rapid growth, stability, and social progress. Their people began to live better, earn more, and dream again. Out of the ruins came a new era of innovation, art, trade, and technology, a renaissance born not from conquest, but from compassion. And yet, the true power of the Marshall Plan lies not in its statistics, but in its spirit. It showed that generosity is a force that can move nations. It proved that the most powerful thing one can do after a war is to choose peace deliberately and invest in it relentlessly. It turned former enemies into allies, competitors into partners, and chaos into cooperation. It demonstrated that rebuilding is not just an economic act, it's a moral one. It requires patience, empathy, and vision. It requires the courage to see beyond borders and to believe that the prosperity of one nation strengthens the stability of all nations. Think about how rare that mindset was. In a time when the memory of conflict was fresh, when hatred still simmered beneath the surface, leaders decided to respond with kindness. That is what made the Marshall Plan extraordinary. It was born not from fear, but from faith. Faith in the human capacity to change, to forgive, to grow. And perhaps that is why it worked so powerfully, because it appealed to the best in people, not the worst. It gave nations not just money, but meaning. It gave them not just relief, but responsibility. It allowed them to stand again, not as victims of war, but as partners in peace today, decades later. The Marshall Plan remains one of the greatest examples of what collective humanity can achieve when vision replaces vengeance. Its influence stretches far beyond post-war Europe. It became a model for how to respond to crises, whether natural disasters, economic collapses, or humanitarian tragedies. It became a reminder that no nation can truly thrive in isolation, and that global stability depends on shared progress. Whenever nations come together to rebuild after disaster, whether after earthquakes, wars, or pandemics, they echo the spirit of the Marshall Plan. That spirit says that hope is always stronger than despair, that unity is always wiser than division, and that building is always greater than breaking, and maybe that's the lesson our modern world still needs. Because while the faces and technologies have changed, the principles have not. We still live in a world torn between greed and generosity, between fear and faith, between self-interest and shared humanity. The Marshall Plan stands as a timeless reminder that even after the darkest nights of destruction, humanity can choose to build dawn again. It shows that the power to rebuild lies not just in governments or policies, but in people in their willingness to help, to trust, to cooperate. It reminds us that nations are strongest not when they stand alone, but when they stand together. It is proof that even in a world scarred by war, the greatest victory is the courage to rebuild peace from the ruins. The year was 1945, and the world had just emerged from the deadliest conflict in human history. Europe was shattered, its cities unrecognizable, its people broken. Bombed-out buildings lined every street, railways were twisted metal, factories lay silent, and hunger haunted every home. The air was thick with grief and uncertainty. Nations that once led the world in art, science, and industry were now fighting for survival. Millions were displaced, governments had collapsed, and economies had ceased to function. The war had ended, but peace had not yet begun. In that bleak silence after destruction, one question hung heavy in the air: who would rebuild this world? From across the Atlantic, the answer began to take shape, not in the form of an army, but in the form of an idea. That idea was the Marshall Plan, the most ambitious act of recovery the modern world had ever seen. At its core, the Marshall Plan was an act of vision, a belief that healing was possible where only ruins remained. It was conceived not out of charity, but out of understanding. America knew that peace built on poverty could never last. The architects of the plan, led by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, saw what many could not, that the future of the world depended on rebuilding Europe, not punishing it. In 1947, Marshall delivered his now legendary speech at Harvard University. He spoke calmly, without drama, but his words carried the weight of wisdom born from war. He proposed that the United States help restore the economic health of Europe, not for dominance, but for stability. He understood that true leadership is not about holding others down, it's about lifting them up. The Marshall Plan was not just financial assistance. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning continent to grasp its scale. Imagine a program that committed over $13 billion, an astronomical sum in that era, to 16 European nations. Those funds went toward rebuilding cities, reviving industries, and restoring trade. But more importantly, they reignited belief. Farmers returned to their fields, factories started to hum again, families began to dream again. Within a few short years, industrial production soared, currencies stabilized, and unemployment fell. Europe began to breathe again, but the numbers alone don't tell the story. The true magic of the Marshall Plan was in what it symbolized: that even after the bloodiest conflict in history, cooperation was possible, that enemies could become partners, that the ashes of war could give birth to a new era of peace and prosperity. The plan's success was not guaranteed. There was skepticism at home and doubt abroad. Some Americans wondered why their nation should spend billions helping others rebuild when their own soldiers had only just returned home. But the leaders behind the plan understood something profound: that rebuilding others was the surest way to protect one's own future. A stable Europe meant fewer wars, more trade, and a world less vulnerable to the chaos that had led to global conflict in the first place. The vision was long-term, an understanding that generosity could be strategic, and that strength could come from solidarity. The plan's architects didn't just rebuild economies, they rebuilt trust. The Marshall Plan also carried a quiet but powerful message: democracy thrives when people have hope. By helping rebuild Europe's economies, the plan helped strengthen democratic institutions and prevent the spread of totalitarian ideologies. Where hunger and hopelessness might have invited extremism, prosperity and cooperation took root instead. In that way, the Marshall Plan became not only an economic triumph, but a moral one. It transformed despair into dignity and turned Reconstruction into a symbol of freedom. The nations of Europe began to see one another not as rivals in recovery, but as partners in progress. Out of that collaboration grew new alliances, shared institutions, and the seeds of what would eventually become the European Union. But perhaps what makes the Marshall Plan so extraordinary is the human story behind it. It wasn't just governments exchanging funds or signing treaties, it was people helping people. American farmers sent food to feed European families. Engineers shared knowledge. Factories in one nation produced materials to rebuild another. It was a web of connection that stretched across borders and languages, bound together by a shared understanding that humanity is stronger when it stands together. For the first time in modern history, the idea of global partnership took form not in words, but in action. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe, it redefined what it meant to be a global community, and yet, the true genius of the Marshall Plan was its faith in self-reliance. America did not simply hand over aid and walk away. The program required European nations to come together, plan collectively, and take ownership of their recovery. It was a partnership, not a rescue. This cooperation forged bonds that would outlast any single generation. It turned recovery into unity and gave birth to a new sense of European identity. The plan taught nations to trust one another again, to see their destinies as interconnected. That trust became the foundation for decades of peace and prosperity, proving that when nations work together, the impossible becomes achievable. By 1952, just 4 years after its implementation, the results were undeniable. Industrial output had risen dramatically, poverty had declined, and trade between nations was flourishing. The scars of war remained, but the spirit of defeat had vanished. Europe was no longer a continent of rubble. It was once again a center of innovation, art, and industry. The Marshall Plan had turned destruction into rebirth. It had shown that leadership could be compassionate and that power could be used to heal rather than to harm. It proved that nations could rise not through conquest, but through cooperation. The influence of the Marshall Plan extended far beyond Europe. It became a model for future recovery efforts around the world. From Asia to Africa to Latin America, nations would look to the principles of the Plan: partnership, accountability, and vision as a blueprint for growth. It redefined international relations, introducing the idea that helping others succeed strengthens everyone. It taught that economic aid could be an instrument of peace, that unity could be a shield against chaos, and that generosity could be the most powerful force in diplomacy. In the years that followed, the Marshall Plan became not just a historical event, but a symbol of what humanity can achieve when compassion meets courage. Even today, the echoes of that plan are felt in every act of global cooperation. Whenever countries come together to rebuild after disaster, whenever relief efforts reach those in need, whenever nations choose to unite rather than divide, the spirit of the Marshall Plan lives on. It remains one of history's greatest reminders that no matter how deep the destruction, recovery is possible when vision replaces vengeance. It showed that out of the darkest hours can come the brightest dawns, if only there is courage enough to create them. The Marshall Plan was more than an economic recovery, it was a declaration of faith in humanity itself. a belief that even after the greatest of wars, the world could be rebuilt not by power, but by purpose. The Marshall Plan stands as one of humanity's greatest testaments to hope, vision, and unity. It proved that even in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction, nations could choose creation over chaos and compassion over conquest. It taught the world that true strength lies not in the ability to dominate, but in the courage to rebuild. It transformed enemies into allies, despair into progress, and a broken continent into a beacon of prosperity. The spirit of the Marshall Plan reminds us that peace is not given, it is built, brick by brick, choice by choice, heart by heart. And as long as the world remembers that lesson, the light born from the ashes of war will never fade.